Greetings from Kenwell. Today is Monday, January the 8th, 2024. I bet by now that a whole lot of you have already given up on your New Year's resolution. Well, one of my main resolutions is to persuade you that science supports the God of the Bible. This would be my last part on the subject. Next week, I delve into the Gospel of Mark. Genesis 1:1 starts off, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And the New Testament, John 1:1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." A paraphrase of the word is an intelligence expressing himself. Later on in the New Testament, we have the Apostle Paul stating in Romans 1:20, "Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." The most famous molecule that has been made is DNA. It consists of approximately 3.4 billion chemical letters in a very specific order. It really does resemble a computer code. As many of you know, DNA determines the sequence of amino acids, and they have to be aligned in a very long and a very complicated sequence. And even today, with modern scientists, they have failed to give any plausible explanation of the origin of how this happened by random, unguided chance. Many of you know, of course, that it was Francis Crick who unraveled the DNA molecule. I love what he said. He said that the origin of life seems almost to be a miracle. Crick's colleague was James Watson, and he was quoted this by the famous mathematician John Lennox. Lennox asked him what his take was on this. He got very angry and he walked away. Crick, a devout atheist, did not want to hear the word miracle associated with the formation of DNA. But DNA really does look like a miracle. John Lennox, in talking to many of the top scientists in this field, they will tell you that they have no idea how it was formed. Once again, we see God's invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, being clearly perceived in the things that have been made. Today I want to look at gravity. Everyone has heard the story where Isaac Newton had an apple fall on his head and voila, he discovered gravity. Of course, that is not true, but Newton did indeed work on his theories of gravity on his parents' farm. One of the things I love about Isaac Newton is that he was a staunch believer in God. Newton believed that God made everything in an orderly fashion. And since God made it, he said, then I can figure it out. And wow, did he ever do a good job. In 1687, Newton published his book called The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which expounds Newton's laws of motion and his law of universal gravitation. Even today, this book is considered the single greatest work in the history of science. In it, he describes universal gravitation and the three laws of motion derived from Kepler's laws. Here to my right is Newton's famous equation on gravity, which is called Newton's law of gravitation, of universal gravitation. I am sure most of you have seen this equation before. Newton's law of gravitation basically is a mathematical description of the way bodies are observed to attract one another, based on many scientific experiments and observations. The gravitational equation says that the force of gravity is proportional to the product of the two masses, m1 and m2. and inversely proportional to the square of the distance r between their centers of mass. Mass, and g, is a gravitational constant. When he came up with this, it is incredibly brilliant. No wonder he is considered one of the greatest scientists of all time. But here is the main point that I want to make with this law. This law has always been true. And doesn't it make sense that behind every law is a lawgiver? If the universe was merely the accidental byproduct of a Big Bang, then why should it obey orderly principles, or any principles at all for that matter? Such laws are consistent with biblical creation. Natural laws exist because the universe has a creator God who is logical and has imposed order on his universe. I want you to think about that. Newton, he was brilliant, of course, in figuring out how gravity works. I like to say we all know the effects of gravity, like no matter how much we want to be like Superman, if we try to fly off of a tall building, we will go splat. But I want to point out that scientists have no idea how gravity formed here on Earth. To prove my point, Dr. Alan Smale is a director of the HEASARC, which is the High Energy Astrophysics Science Archive Research Center at NASA. That's a long title. He was asked the question, what is gravity? He said, well, we really don't know. He said, we can define what it is as a field of influence because we know how it operates in the universe. And some scientists think that it is made up of particles called gravitons, which travel at the speed of light. However, if we are to be honest, we do not know what gravity is in any fundamental way. We only know how it behaves. And remember that evolutionists say this happened by random, unguided chance. I like to say that there is no way on God's green earth that gravity formed by chance. It sure points to a creator God who masterfully made planet Earth that is so perfectly suited for life. Well, I have shown in these last few videos that it is impossible for the first cell to have formed by random, unguided chance. Hence, no first cell, then there is absolutely no possibility of evolution. I've also shown that the universe is so finely tuned for life, and that if it wasn't fine-tuned, there would be absolutely no possibility of life here on planet Earth. And today, DNA is indeed a language. And when you think of it logically, behind every language, there is a creator. I've also shown that we know the laws of gravity, but as yet, we do not fully understand how it all happened. But since God made gravity in an orderly fashion, hopefully one day we will be able to figure it out. In closing, I want to tell you about the difference between happiness and joy. For me, I have to tell you the happiness is when Dar and I are on a beach and we're walking hand in hand. I get to look over at the only true love of my life, and having your warm, tender hand in mine really makes me feel happy. But joy is really different from happiness. Joy is that intangible knowledge that I have in my heart, that no matter what the circumstances or how bad any outcome can be, Jesus is always there for me. In my life, I have had a few circumstances where I have experienced joy in dire circumstances. Like, for example, I've had 2 operations for tongue cancer, and even in my darkest moments, Jesus gave me joy in my heart. I know that no matter what happens to me, ultimately, I will be with Jesus in heaven for all eternity. Now, this last week, on January 2nd, I almost had an outcome that would have been extremely unfavorable to the love of my life, Darlene. Here's what happened. I came out of an office building and onto the sidewalk in downtown Toronto. I looked to my left and nothing was coming. Well, for some reason, I quickly checked something on my phone. I put it back in my pocket, and then without looking again, I started to step out onto the street. If I had continued, I would for sure have been killed as a truck was speeding along the street. There is no way that I would have survived. But here is the interesting thing. I felt like I was pulled from the street back onto the sidewalk. Now, you may not believe this, but it is like an angel of God pulled me back onto that sidewalk. There is no other explanation that I can come up with as to why I got back on the sidewalk, as my forward momentum was carrying me out onto the street. Needless to say, I was scared, as I could have been easily killed. I thank God that He has allowed me to live a little longer. Well, ever since that has happened, it has been going over and over in my mind how close I was to being killed. Oh, and it would have been my fault for not looking the second time. It sure makes me appreciate life. Well, the Bible says in Psalm 91 verse 11, "For He will give us angels charge of me to guard you in all your ways." And I firmly believe in my heart that God did indeed send an angel to help me. If it had been tragic, I'd like to say, hopefully some of you would have missed me. Being in heaven sounds great, but I would like to see my grandson Hudson grow up. So with all that said, may the good Lord be with you until we meet again.